each generation is different in how they approach the church and how they approach culture. So tell us, Bishop, what has shaped millennials from the current culture, and how has that affected the church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if we take it from embryo to maturity, all of us live our lives from the embryo of childhood. So whatever we are in the embryonic stage begins to develop until when we become adults, it's telescoped out. So, and in that telescoping, there are things in the embryo that show up wider and wider and wider and wider till we get to adults. So we never escape our childhood. It's one of the reasons I think Jesus says that except you become as little children, you can't enter the kingdom. You can't see the kingdom, you can't enter it. And every generation has to come to terms with the fact that while this text has been around forever, we have to engage it in the current context of our lives and navigate our way through life, not just engaging the text, but the God of the text, and finding out how He is interacting with us in the current context. So millennials, like every other generation that preceded them, comes from a generation that preceded them. So I am the product of where I came from. I'm not independent of where I came from. The challenge becomes for every generation, and especially now for the millennial generation, as they're coming of age, is to discover, where did I come from? So the existential question, not just who am I, but where did I come from? Because I can't really answer who am I unless I don't know where I came from. And when we don't understand where we came from, we really don't understand where we are. And when we don't understand where we are, we don't know where we're going. So if we look at a brief view of the last 100 years, because ultimately where we are today goes all the way back to the beginning. So we don't want to go back thousands of years in history to see how we got here. But if we want to look at recent history, let's say the last 100 or so years, things have radically changed since the 19th and 20th century. Up until the 21st century, the last 2 centuries were governed by what we need to understand would be a rational narrative. Rational reason, the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, which was an anti-God development. So I think, therefore I am. René Descartes. Now, while we're starting with him as the beginning of the Enlightenment and the age of reason, he didn't come out of a vacuum. We'd have to go all the way back to the beginning of philosophy and the Greeks, and then Augustine, to understand where all that progressed to and progressed from. But when René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, we can all of a sudden begin to look at where modern thought came from. And now we're in the postmodern and beyond postmodern era. But I think, therefore I am, it has a profound impact on where millennials are right now. So from that, only what was rationally, scientifically proven true through the senses could be validated. So if it's not rational, it's not logical. And if it's not logical, it's not true. So that dismisses any aspect of the emotional part of our being, as well as relationship to transcendence. So every one of us has this deep yearning for transcendence. That can't be satisfied unless there's a divine being. Now, today we have all sorts of notions of spirituality, but ultimately, if we want to really talk from a biblical perspective, transcendence is impossible apart from God, because only in God do we transcend any sense of limitation. So we grew up, baby boomers, baby busters, Gen Xers, Gen Yers, millennials, we grew up, or up till the millennials, grew up in the 20th century with stories that were told that were logical and rational, that could be explained. And it was a flat world. It was a very flat world, because the Enlightenment flattened the world out. And so by the time you get to my generation, the baby boomer generation, we were tired of a flat world. And so we had heard about self-actualization by Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and Rollo May, but we turned it into self-fulfillment. And so the baby boomers wanted the best of everything because we were looking for fulfillment. And self-fulfillment has now become self-centered narcissism, and we don't even realize how deeply it's embedded in the culture. And so the sense of entitlement and all that goes with it is part of where we now are, so that it's no longer I think, therefore I am. It's I feel, therefore I am. So now it's totally subjective. There's no such thing as objectivity because there is no such thing as absolute truth, which we can thank voices like Jacques Derrida and Richard Rorty for postmodern thought. Now, most millennials wouldn't know their names, but they're the reason they think the way they think, because it's the academic world that has influenced the way millennials think. And so the whole notion of deconstructing things, especially grammar and life and reality, all our words really don't mean what they say. So therefore, we can question everything, and every institution began to be questioned in the 1980s. So what happens is in the 1960s, in my generation, the countercultural revolution, the sexual revolution, all of that came about because of the introduction into the Western world of the pill. So now that there was a pill, there could be all sorts of freedom from sexual restraint without worrying about getting pregnant. And with the pill came abortion. And with all of that, and by the way, all of that started with a woman named Virginia Woolf in 1906. And, you know, there was a major Hollywood film in my generation called Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And it was a play as well. But Virginia Woolf in 1906 made the statement that no longer would truth be and I'm paraphrasing, truth would no longer be the product of our institutions, including the church. But truth would be found, and morality would be found in the arts. So all of a sudden, she's rejecting all of the truth that is religious truth, and she is now saying the arts are the determiners of morality, which became very libertine. So the amoral, immoral approach to life and sexuality that has become the revolution that it is in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and now I feel, therefore I am. So now if I feel like I'm not what I was born sexually, I can shift because I validate everything by my feelings because I now become the voice of authority. But that goes back to Virginia Woolf in 1906.
So you're saying the millennial generation is not as unique and different than any other generation?
No. No. And they think that the millennials that think they are just as deceived as every other generation that thought the same thing, just like my generation did in the 1960s. We all think we're the first, you know. But Billy Joel wrote a song, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. It's probably one of the most powerful 3-minute prophetic songs that he wrote for our generation, and he goes through all of history and shows us we're not the first ones around this block. We're not we may be the new kids on the block, but the block has been here long before we ran around it.